Ambassador Churkin is a very delightful gentleman, as you will find out when he lectures to you today. My wife and I have had the opportunity to spend time with him. He's been able to ski for a couple of days at Deer Valley and then a couple of days in Moab at the different national parks. And yesterday, probably one of the wildest rides other than a taxi cab in New York, jeeping on trails that I know had him clutching the seat very tightly. Anyway, Ambassador Churkin has a very distinguished career. He has been ambassador of Russia to Belgium as well as to Canada. He was involved with the foreign ministry in the USSR as well as the foreign ministry in Russia. So he's seen the pre-Russia and the post-Soviet Union times in various capacities as a spokesman for the Russian foreign ministry, as well as being the deputy foreign minister. He is also the head of the council, the Arctic Council, dealing with Arctic issues of nations that surround the Arctic. We've had a wonderful opportunity to discuss quite a number of those issues as we've been together for the past several days. One of the things that I find fascinating is his work on the Security Council. As you know, Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, and to talk about or listen to his explanations of some of the very thorny problems that the Security Council is facing is quite fascinating. But in all, he has had a very distinguished career with the former Soviet Union as well as with the Russian Federation. He and his wife have been most gracious as guests here in the state of Utah, and we're just delighted to have him here. Let's please welcome Ambassador Churkin.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for this welcome, and Mr. Butler, thank you very much for your introduction. It's my first time in Utah, and miracles started happening even before I arrived, because I started preparing my remarks a while ago, and only when I arrived here I realized that you are participating in Model UN. And it so happened that my remarks for this occasion, I've entitled them Russia's Contribution to the United Nations. So they are going to be specifically targeted at describing a gamut of issues in which Russia is involved in the United Nations, not just one or two hot topics of today. And those are very brief remarks. They are just talking points. It's not sort of a well-structured lecture to which I'm sure you're used in this university. And it will take, I think, like 10, 12 minutes for me to go through those remarks, and then I'll be happy to try to answer your questions. Well, without further ado, the United Nations emerged from the scourge of World War II. Having played a crucial role in the formation of the anti-Hitlerite coalition and having made a decisive contribution to the defeat of Nazism, the Soviet Union became a co-founder of the United Nations and a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Consolidating the UN system is one of the most important priorities of the Russian foreign policy. The diversity of modern challenges makes active joint work imperative. Unilateral actions have not resolved and cannot resolve a single problem. On the contrary, they have generated new tragedies and hotbeds of tension. Wars, regional and local conflicts have not become less numerous. They are augmented by crises on stock markets and in the area of food security. However, as an ancient proverb has it, crisis is a threat, but also an opportunity. Thus, the current situation in the world can be regarded as a motivation to begin efficient joint work. The UN system is uniquely suited for that. After the end of the Cold War, the organization came out of the inter-bloc paralysis and is capable of realizing the enormous potential it has been invested with by the Founding Fathers. Today, the agenda of the UN, and above all its Security Council, contains a number of crucial issues related to international peace and stability. These include the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, Kosovo, the nuclear programs of Iran and North Korea, conflicts in Africa, and many others. Russia is of the view that there is no alternative to politico-diplomatic settlement of numerous crises in the world. We must exercise involvement, not isolation. Yes, a multilateral search for solutions presupposes discussion and compromises, but isn't it precisely what acting democratically means? Russia is in favor of intensifying the dialogue within the UN on international security, disarmament, and non-proliferation. In the field of disarmament, we attach great importance to preventing deployment of weapons in outer space. For a number of years, the UN General Assembly, at our initiative, has almost unanimously adopted the resolution entitled Transparency and Confidence-Building Measures in Outer Space Activities. At the Disarmament Conference in Geneva, Russia, in collaboration with China, introduced a draft treaty on the non-deployment of weapons in outer space. And when I've said almost unanimously, it means that the United States was the only country which voted against. So if you want to, I'll return to that. Our logic is simple. Why waste dozens and perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars weaponizing outer space and creating new threats whose consequences cannot be predicted now? Wouldn't it be better to invest these resources in tackling the numerous real problems the world is confronting today? Russia is forging a collective approach to combating terrorism. Our country has been instrumental in working out an international legal basis for counter-terrorist activities, including the Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism and the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy. In the recent years, the role of the UN peacekeeping operations has increased. The UN peacekeeping operations are becoming an important element of regional conflict and crisis resolution and a tool facilitating state building in countries of deployment. Over 100,000 peacekeepers participate in 22 UN peacekeeping operations across the globe. Within the framework of the UN peacekeeping, a wide array of programs are implemented aimed at assisting countries in reforming their security sector, developing law enforcement agencies, the army, and the police. The Russian Federation is increasing its role in the UN peacekeeping activities. Russian peacekeepers are involved in 12 peacekeeping operations carried out under the aegis of the United Nations. The largest Russian peacekeeping corps is deployed in southern Sudan as part of the UN mission in that country. A Russian aviation group, which is now part of the Euroforce, will participate in the UN peacekeeping operation in Chad and the Central African Republic. We are also planning to assign an engineering company and a hospital to that UN mission. Over the past few years, peacekeepers from many African countries have undergone training at Russian specialized training facilities. Russian instructors work in peacekeeping centers abroad in Africa as well as Europe. Russia is supporting politically and financially the Peace-Building Commission, one new element, one of the results of the reform efforts in the United Nations. The Commission coordinates international assistance to countries emerging from crisis. We commit considerable resources to the Peace-Building Fund used to finance reconstruction projects in those countries. An important role in UN activities to ensure collective security belongs to regional organization. Cooperation and interaction between the UN and those entities is constantly improved. Such regional organizations as Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, the European Union, African Union, and the League of Arab States substantially strengthen the UN potential in the area of political diplomatic settlement of conflicts and peacekeeping. Cooperation between the UN and regional organizations becomes effective only if the UN Charter is respected. What I mean above all is that the mandate to conduct peacekeeping operations can be given only by the UN Security Council. Russia is promoting, under the auspices of the United Nations, dialogue and partnership of civilizations. Our effort is based on our own centuries-long experience of peaceful coexistence of numerous peoples, cultures, and religious traditions. To disregard the diversity of the modern world is to come into conflict with the imperatives of globalization and is to create serious risks to international stability. It is essential to help the establishment of dialogue between the representatives of various religions. Russia has proposed creating within the UN a consultative council of religions as an important venue for religious leaders to discuss relevant problems on the UN agenda. As a first step, the Director General of UNESCO initiated a brainstorming exercise which will hopefully lead to the establishment of such a council. We are contributing to collective efforts under the auspices of the UN in the human rights area. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the first international treaty in the area of human rights in the 21st century, was drafted and adopted with our active participation. Russia was also directly involved in adopting, and has already ratified, another important document, the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflict. As we mark the 70th anniversary of the beginning of World War II this year, we witness incongruously new attempts to revise history, glorify Nazism, and even award Nazis and their supporters the title of heroes of national liberation movements. We regard such actions as inadmissible and believe that they run counter to the obligations of member states under the UN Charter. For 4 consecutive years, the UN General Assembly has adopted, at the initiative of the Russian Federation, a resolution concerning modern forms of racism. That document condemns glorification of the Nazi movement and former Waffen-SS members, particularly by opening monuments and memorials and holding public demonstrations. The document stresses that such actions defile the memory of the innumerable victims of fascism and are absolutely incompatible with the UN member states' obligations. In the economic file, Russia is increasing its contribution to development assistance as a donor country. This became possible thanks to the impressive success achieved by Russia in the socio-economic field in the past 8 years. Russia is one of the world leaders in writing off foreign debt. In 2008, we have cancelled $20 billion of African countries' debt to Russia. Iraq's debt to our country, which amounted to nearly $13 billion, has been settled. We have reduced Afghanistan's debt from over $11 billion to just over $700 million. And we do not categorize cancelled debt as foreign assistance. A joint response is needed to address the food crisis. At the G8 summit in Japan, the President of Russia put forward an initiative of convening the Global Grain Summit to be held in St. Petersburg in June of this year. Its aim is to work out specific measures to stabilize the situation in the world grain sector. Russia continues to be involved in providing food assistance through the World Food Programme. We attach great importance to establishing international cooperation in the area of countering climate change. During the Russian presidency in G8 in 2006, the Petersburg Plan of Action in this sphere was approved. Russia is actively involved in the international efforts to counter global climate change. We are among those few countries which overfulfill their obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. The Russian government is taking additional steps to enhance energy efficiency and therefore to reduce greenhouse gases emission per production unit. The latest decisions of the government provide for a 40% reduction of the GDP energy intensity by 2020. At the negotiations on the future international climate regime beyond 2012, that is post-Kyoto period, at those negotiations lodged after the International Climate Change Conference in Bali, Russia advocates the need for all countries without exception to participate in the resolution of this problem. Russia supports international activities in the area of global health. Moscow hosted twice, in 2006 and 2008, International HIV/AIDS Conference for countries of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Our voluntary contribution to the global fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria amounts to $40 million. We're also involved in financing various multilateral health programs. For example, we allocate nearly $80 million to fund vaccine purchase. The global financial and economic crisis has radically transformed the geopolitical situation. The crisis makes us focus our attention on urgent issues rather than virtual projects. Even though much of the attention in this regard is focused on the activities of the G20, which held its first summit in November 2008 in Washington and will convene again in 3 weeks in London, the UN also has an important role to play. A high-level UN conference on the global financial and economic crisis and its impact on development will be convened in New York in early June. We regard the conference as one of the key fora to seek collective solutions to complex crisis-related problems and to determine major areas of international cooperation on setting up a more efficient system of international economic relations. The diversity of challenges humanity faces calls for strengthening the UN system. To keep up with the time, the UN needs further rational reforms. But the UN is an international organization rather than a corporation. Therefore, decisions on reform should be based on the broadest possible agreement after consultations among member states. This approach equally applies to the expansion of the Security Council membership. At present, the intergovernmental talks are underway at the UN on the Security Council reform. They show that states advocating different approaches remain far from being able to reach compromise. In this situation, we see no alternative but to continue the search for a common denominator in the positions of major protagonists. The goal is to work out a formula of the broadest possible agreement among member states regarding the sensitive issue of the Security Council expansion. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, the UN is an association of states. All achievements of the organization are our successes, and all of its failures are our common errors. The UN cannot fulfill its potential on its own. What is needed is active engagement and goodwill of all states and all people interested in the activities of the United Nations, I might add. Thank you very much. Any questions? Any questions? Please. You.
Yeah, why don't you introduce your name and what committee you're representing as well? Okay, my name is Patrick Lowe. Thank you. My name is Patrick Lowe. I'm representing ECOSOC Plenary on the Model UN team. I'm just wondering, Russia's efforts in developing, as an emerging economy, what are Russia's efforts in developing partnerships with developing nations?
Well, you know, you caught me off guard on this one. Yeah. First of all, I don't think we are already beyond the stage of emerging economy. I mean, we are clearly a well-established economy. We are, as many other countries now, in a situation of rather difficult economic problems caused by the financial crisis. But as I mentioned in my remarks, we have had a very successful 8 years of development, and if I'm not mistaken, Russia has become the seventh largest to eighth largest economy in the world. So it's even though there are numerous problems associated with modernization of Russian economy, and as we were having this successful run of 8 years economically, the Russian government was working out plans of innovation and renovation, if you will, of Russian economy, because, as you know, it is heavily based now on oil export, gas export, and things like that, even though we have historically some very good foundations in high-tech industries. We are very strong in aviation, we are very strong in space, exploration and things like that, and in some other areas. So the idea is to try to refocus our economy from energy export mainly to high-tech innovation thing. And now, as the crisis set in, the task of the government is to deal with the crisis, but also not to lose sight of those long-term goals for the Russian economy. So even through the crisis, the reform effort is continuing. And as to our role with developing countries and others, certainly we have a very important role to play. Like I mentioned, one thing, we have this Euro-Asian Economic Cooperation system where Russia is working on economic matters together with some former republics of the Soviet Union, Central Asian countries, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and there we have contributed over $7 billion to the sort of stabilization fund for that institution, and in other areas too. Again, as I mentioned, we are not regarding ourselves anymore as a country which is a recipient of international assistance. We are switching into the mode of a donor country, and there also our active businesses are a great support, because I mean you cannot it's not usually done altruistically. Usually two things go hand in hand. You have some economic interests in Africa, and also you do your humanitarian programs and assistance programs in those countries. So that is being applied more and more to some places in Africa, to some places in Latin America. So Russia, in a way, is re-emerging internationally after it has receded somewhat in its international positions compared with where the Soviet Union was in like 80s, 70s, in a new form and shape, of course, based on market interests and the globalization processes rather than on ideology, which very often used to be the case in the course of the Cold War. So there is a major reorientation of focus underway of Russia contributing to globalization, contributing to the solution of the various crisis issues across the globe. Oops, sorry, you were, please.
Okay, sorry. My name is Peter Wright. I'm a Russian in history.
I never saw him before he stood up. But anyway, please.
Sorry. Yes, I'm a Russian and history major from Orem, Utah. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to discuss the consequences of the unfortunate precedent set by the United States support of Kosovo's unilateral declaration of independence in Russia or in the area of the former Soviet Union and throughout the world. Thanks.
Well, that was a big ideological and philosophical and political argument we had in various places, including the Security Council. And we were very strongly of the opinion that to announce Kosovo's independence and to support Kosovo's independence would send a very bad signal internationally because, well, there are different counts. Maybe some professors in this university do their own counts. But the figure I've heard is that there are like 200 places in the world where similar situations can occur and where people can claim the right to independence. I mean, in international law, this is something of a gray area, and I mean, must be a balance between the right of people to self-determination, of various ethnic groups to self-determination, and the territorial integrity of states. And we feel very strongly that those issues can come to the fore only when there is sort of immediate danger to the survival of those people. And in the case of Kosovo, that was not the case when the independence was proclaimed, because there was a conflict there in 1990 and a rather difficult situation when NATO intervened. The history of that was also quite complex. I'm not going into it. It's not black and white thing at all. But since that time, for 8 years after the conflict in 1999, when Resolution 1214 was adopted by the Security Council and the United Nations, and when international presences moved in after the NATO bombings of Kosovo and Serbia, things were supposed to normalize. And some of them have happened according to Resolution 1214. Others have not happened. I mean, what has happened, international presences were there. And the government in Belgrade, the government of Serbia, was respecting the role the international presences were playing there. What has not happened, there was no return of Serb refugees to Kosovo, and no conditions were created for a real ethnic harmony in Kosovo. We were there on a mission of the Security Council in spring of 2007, I think, and it was obvious that only 5% of the refugees returned, and people were too scared to return. No way the Serbs could be living normally in Kosovo. Out of 40,000 or 18,000 Serbs in Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, before the conflict, like 18 or 20 were remaining. So that was the situation. And in our view, in a situation where the Serbs, Belgrade, were not posing any threat to the population in Kosovo, to the Albanians in Kosovo, and rather what the international community needed to continue to do was to create conditions for multi-ethnic coexistence in Kosovo. The proclamation of independence in Kosovo was unjustified. It was in violation of this resolution of the Security Council, which basically established international supervision of Kosovo. And talks should have continued in order for the Serbs and the Albanians to find accommodation where Pristina and Belgrade could coexist, and where finally the Serbs would be comfortable enough to return to Kosovo and, in a situation of peace and multi-ethnic harmony. As to international, specifically the international repercussions, I remember our South African ambassador who just left the United Nations after a tour of 10 years, a very colorful, strong diplomat, said, "We in Africa have plenty of people who need no provocation in order to start redrawing borders. African borders have often been drawn artificially. So with that provocation, there are all sorts of consequences that can follow." So we did believe and continue to believe now that that was the wrong thing to do and was sending a very bad signal. Now, some of you might ask why Russia believes that it was wrong to recognize Kosovo, but why did Russia go ahead and recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia after the conflict in the Caucasus last August? It was precisely because the actions of the Georgians as they invaded South Ossetia posed a threat to the very existence of those countries. And while the government of Serbia was respecting those international arrangements, the government of Georgia, by attacking South Ossetia, by attacking Russian peacekeepers in South Ossetia, broke all the peacekeeping arrangements which have existed in Georgia in its relations with South Ossetia and Abkhazia since early 1990s, since the breakup of the Soviet Union. So, well, first of all, we were compelled to move in to prevent ethnic cleansing in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and then we were compelled to recognize those countries, because then we had the legal foundation to bring in our troops to those countries for them to serve as ultimate guarantors of their survival. And this is a role Russia has played for centuries in the Caucasus, in that part of the world. So the use of force in breach of international peacekeeping arrangements was the legal cause and justification, if you will, for our recognition of those countries. And I hope I've made clear the differences we see in those two situations, why it was impossible for us not to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and why it was, on the other hand, wrong and dangerous to recognize Kosovo in a situation where there was plenty of opportunity. And in fact, by Security Council resolution, the international community was motivated to continue negotiations for a political settlement and sort of normal coexistence between Serbs and Albanians in Kosovo. Please. Now, it was your turn, I'm sorry. And then I'll go to you.
My name is Sarah Jarman, and I'm representing the Organization for Security and Coordination of Europe. And my question for you is, given the economic global crisis and considering the levels of unemployment and homelessness that are pervading globally, I was wondering, Russia has been giving priority in terms of giving jobs to Russians right now, Russian citizens, which is, of course, what Russia should be doing. But Russia also has a large migrant population, which composes a lot of your labor force. And I was wondering how Russia is going to be dealing with the migrant population in regards to the fact that the majority of them are currently unemployed and homeless, and if Russia is worried that political destabilization will ensue within the region, and if so, how does Russia plan on addressing this issue?
Well, this is not exactly a UN issue, but it's a very important matter, of course. I can give you only my personal opinion from what I read in the news, what's happening in Russia about it, and it's an issue also in our relations with some of the countries of Commonwealth of Independent States from which those people come. I believe that, and I think this is the government, the attitude of the Russian government, that a very delicate balance needs to be struck. Because on the one hand, you have people who are there and who are doing important work. I mean, they are there because there were no Russians to do this work. So I don't think that there is a danger that all of them are going to be evicted overnight, because if it were to happen, then there will be no immediate replacement from Russians anyway. But in some situations, I suppose, as Russian unemployment is rising, there could be certain adjustments which would allow those places to be filled by Russians who are becoming unemployed in the course of the crisis, but also sort of rerouting the flow of immigrants which come from those other countries. And of course, we talk about it with governments for Central Asia. There are many migrant workers from Central Asia. There are many migrant workers from Ukraine, and we're in conversation with those governments about it. One good thing which has happened over the past few years is that the entire operation has been legalized, because it was a very big problem that as the Soviet Union, disintegrated and all those independent countries emerged, we were in a maybe unique situation when we had the longest border in the world, and it was completely unguarded, unprotected, and people could come and go and work there without any work permit, without paying any taxes, and I heard a figure of one ethnic group, I'm not going to name it, from one of the countries of the former Soviet Union. In Moscow, they had like almost 600,000 people, and only 300 of them were paying taxes. But since that time, things have been at least sort of legalized and normalized. Rules about hiring those people and things. But now we face a different challenge of, as I say, striking a delicate balance between the need to find employment for Russians who are newly unemployed, and also to make sure that there is no harm to those people who have come as migrant workers. There is no harm to the economies of the countries they came from, and there is sort of a harmonious relationship on the workplace. I mean, there is plenty of work for everybody in Russia, I can tell you. So I don't see it as emerging as a major crisis. It's clearly a concern, because I've seen so much about it on our television and written in our newspapers. But I don't see it culminating in kind of a crisis within Russia, or a crisis between Russia and the countries those people come from.
My name is Gloria Gong, and I'm representing Russia on the Security Council for BYU's Model UN team. Russia has been really active in the Quartet to the Middle East, and I believe Moscow is hosting their next meeting. Can you comment on Russia's expected role in the peacekeeping process between Israel and Palestine?
Well, indeed, Russia is, there are four members in the Quartet, a very interesting kind of international setup. The United Nations, represented by the Secretary General of the United Nations, European Union, represented by usually Presidency of the European Union and the Commission, United States and Russia. This is the four participants in the Quartet. It came out historically of the so-called Madrid process, when the United States and the Soviet Union were two co-chairmen of the Middle East process. And indeed, the Quartet continues to have its meetings. The last one they had on the margins of this conference, Egypt convened in Sharm el-Sheikh on the assistance to the Palestinians in Gaza, though that was kind of a meeting where they didn't adopt any documents, get together. They didn't have much time, and a fresh U.S. administration needed probably more time to prepare for that meeting. You mentioned Moscow. Moscow is supposed to host a conference. The past year was the year of the so-called Annapolis process, when the U.S. administration hosted an international conference in Annapolis in November of 2007, I think. But unfortunately, the Annapolis process did not bring about what it was hoped it would. It did not bring about any tangible breakthrough in the Israeli-Arab negotiations. And it was agreed even then, when Annapolis conference was taking place, that the next big conference, when the time is right, will be held in Moscow. So we are actively preparing it, consulting with various parties. One impediment is that there is no government in Israel. We hope that when one is formed in Israel, before too long, the dates are going to be set for the Moscow conference, hopefully before the end of the first half of this year. And we hope that it will reinvigorate the peace process in the Middle East. Let me tell you, I personally worry a lot about the Middle East, because frankly, and speaking undiplomatically, I think that things are not going, they are going in the opposite directions. Because, we'll see what the new government in Israel is going to come up with, but I do believe that, realistically speaking, one might expect positions which would not be in line with what is expected by the Quartet and not in line with continuing the Annapolis process, very hard demands from Israel and difficult expectations on the Palestinians. At the same time, there is no unity among the Palestinians. One thing the Russian diplomacy is trying to do is to bring about Palestinian unity, because it's one thing to criticize Hamas or people associated with Hamas for their terrorist activity, but it's the other thing not to recognize that it's a very important political force among the Palestinians, not to recognize that they won democratic elections some time ago in Gaza. Of course, we do not approve what they did in Gaza, having sort of taken over basically the place by force. But we have our contacts with them, and we keep urging them to return to the platform of the quartet, which does involve recognition of Israel, and we keep trying to find ways for the two major Hamas and Fatah, Abbas and Hamas, to reconcile their political differences, which would be extremely important for the Palestinians and would be useful for the political process. But so far, I personally am very concerned that the explosive potential of the Middle East is growing rather than sort of being reduced by diplomatic efforts.
My name is Artis Smith. I'm representing Russia to the United Nations Development Fund for Women. Security Council resolutions 1325 and 1820 have established the importance of international discussion on women and peace and security. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about Russia's efforts in including women in its peacekeeping and peace-building efforts, and generally how women can be involved from Russia's point of view.
Well, I think it's an extremely important thing, and much is being said in the Security Council and in the broader United Nations about the role of women. Unfortunately, being frank, as I usually try to do, I cannot say that Russia is in the forefront. It is not showing much of its sort of own example in breaking grounds in terms of women's involvement in international affairs, or in government affairs for that matter, or in peacekeeping. But I think there is a sense that we must work hard on that, and Russia certainly is very sympathetic to those things. We just had there are so many things. When you come again to New York, you see that many things are happening. We had some roundtable on women's issues in New York, and a delegation came from Russia, and I talked to the head of that delegation, a member of the Federation Council, our Senate, back in Russia, and she came up with an interesting idea, and I wonder if we're going to be able to pursue that, to have a discussion, a debate in the General Assembly about violence as such, violence in international relations, where women could also sort of voice their perspective on violence as they see it, as a phenomenon in international relations. I thought it was a great idea, and I hope we're going to be able to successfully carry it through, and I'm sure that will enhance the profile of Russian women as a force in the affairs of the United Nations. Wow, so many. I don't want to. Please, and then yes, please. No, you. I'm pointing at you. Yes, miss. You. Yes, you. Yeah. And you will be next, okay?
Hi, my name is Amanda Layson. I'm representing the delegation in the Food and Agriculture Organization. And as you mentioned before, Russia is very dominant in the energy market, especially oil and natural gas. But over the last couple of months, there has been a trend towards alternative energies, including bioenergy. And so my question is, will these changes in oil prices affect Russia's policy toward bioenergy and push Russia to look into bioenergy in order to meet the demands of their European customers?
It might, but however, I want to mention one thing. Russia has become a grain exporter. So again, returning to its historic tradition before the revolution of 1917, Russia was a major grain exporter. In fact, continued to be even after the revolution. Then we had major economic difficulties in the Soviet Union in 50s and 60s, and Russia has become a net importer of grain. Now, the past few years, again, we have returned to exporting presence on international markets. So we hope we can contribute also to the resolution of the food crisis. In fact, we are convening a grain summit in St. Petersburg in order to discuss those issues. On bioenergy, we have always been, and I think prudently, very cautious, because we do believe that, at least in part, the bioenergy drive was responsible to the food crisis which we confronted, when some of the things which were supposed to go into the food chain were instead going into the energy chain. And sometimes the energy benefits of that were not obvious. So it was, but I feel that somehow proper conclusions have been drawn, and people realize that where some mistakes were made in this bioenergy area. But as to specifically as to how Russia will respond to this new situation, I cannot tell. I'm not an expert enough. As President Reagan used to say, I'm not a scientist enough to address this issue. Please. Yes.
My name is Jordan Trebus. I'm studying public relations, and I just wanted to know, with the recent economic crisis, what you viewed as Russia's responsibilities kind of in the international economy, and then what you also viewed as America's responsibilities to help to stabilize the economy and to promote growth.
America's responsibility. Just a little joke maybe. Recently, a new U.S. ambassador came to New York, as you know, Ambassador Susan Rice, and I arranged a little luncheon to welcome her and invited some ambassadors and said, I think that Russia is a unique partner for the United States in the United Nations, because most of the countries in the United Nations want the United States to do more. Russia is a country which would not mind if the United States from time to time were to do less. So I don't, I think that the United States needs to be responsive to what the world is expecting of it and of those people and institutions who are responsible for financial stability and the continued economic progress, and also what we believe in Russia, that the financial system, well, first of all, it must become more transparent, and secondly, it must be democratized. All the decisions on financial matters cannot be taken only in Washington by IMF or by the President of the United States. The United States, of course, has this very serious responsibility. You are printing the green ones. And somehow, and again, I'm not a financial expert, and we have a 20-page document prepared of Russian position for the upcoming London summit of the G20. So we're involved on an expert level, our Ministry of Finance, of how exactly it should be accomplished. But certainly the situation cannot continue when everything is concentrated in one particular center. And should you catch cold in the United States, then immediately the entire world is having the flu. So those discussions will continue in the G20. We'll have a meeting in the United Nations. So there is still a long way to go on trying to do it right. Please. Yeah.
My name is Zach Barney, and I am representing the Russian Federation in the World Trade Organization. And I've noticed that since the dawn of President Putin's presidency, he has been very active in trying to accede Russia into the World Trade Organization. And then as various barriers came up, Russia took a more passive approach. What is Russia's current stance on acceding into the World Trade Organization?
It's a very good question, even though this organization is based in Geneva, fortunately, and I don't have to deal with it immediately. But this is, well, first of all, we do continue to want to become a member of the World Trade Organization. But the second thing is that we are not going to join it on conditions which are going to be detrimental to our economy. And unfortunately, it has not been a glorious chapter in our relations with the United States during the presidency of President Putin, the first years of this century, because, on matters such as membership of countries in the World Trade Organization, especially countries like Russia, political decisions are very important. Those technical negotiations which are underway are equally important. But then you must take certain political decisions. And in those years, several times we were told, well, 2004 you are going to become a member. 2006 you are going to become a member. And we seem to have sort of completed those technical negotiations on all issues. Then just one issue remains. But then they say, okay, but wait a minute. there is this other issue which is still there, so why don't you also look at that issue? So we had the feeling that, first of all, there was no full understanding of the complexity of transition of Russia from basically closed economy during the Soviet Union and now open economy in terms of finances, the movement of capital and stuff like that. And the need for us to have a transition period to protect some of our interests and some of our economic sectors, and no really strong political decision to see Russia in the World Trade Organization. So I personally would be very interested to see how this whole matter is revisited with the Obama administration. Is the United States going to provide this political leadership and make this political decision that finally it's time to wrap up those technical negotiations, and there always must be compromise in those negotiations, and to have Russia included as a member of the World Trade Organization. Please.
My name is Timothy Wright, and I'm studying history and German. And having lived in Norway and Scandinavia, I know that those nations are very preoccupied with questions concerning the Arctic and how exactly nations are going to interact in exploring that region. So I'm just wondering what's the Russian Federation's intentions, or how do they envision how nations will interact in the eventual exploitation of the Arctic region for energy sources, etc.
Well, our intentions are strictly honorable, I can tell you, in Arctica. And I've had, Rusty mentioned it briefly, I've had a very interesting experience. I must say it's a fascinating area, Arctic cooperation. There is such an intergovernmental forum as the Arctic Council. And Russia is one of the founding members. I mean, the Arctic countries, including the United States, are members. The Nordic countries, Russia, the United States, and Canada are members of that council. And it is this rather modest institution, no bureaucracy at all, but it is involved in some fascinating, very important matters. Like, it's the only intergovernmental forum I know of where indigenous people sit at the table together with the representatives of governments. They do not have sort of a vote, but usually votes are not taken. Everything is determined by consensus there. But it gives them a direct opportunity to discuss their concerns immediately with representatives of governments at an international setting. Then they look at climate issues. They look at Arctic exploitation. And, I mean, we are for cooperation. As one example, we are starting major cooperation with Norway, and I think a French company got in on exploitation of a gas place in the Barents Sea, a major gas deposit in Russia's possession, but inviting others to cooperate. One big issue which you may have come across in the newspapers is the territorial issue, because the continental shelf has not yet been divided in Arctica, and some of the exploits of our scientists have caught the eye of international public, I think very deservedly, because it was quite a feat of science and courage, I think, to go down on the bottom of the Arctic Sea in those small submarines. I think it was an amazing thing to do. But there is, fortunately, an international mechanism to deal with those issues. I mean, countries are supposed, by a certain date, I think in 2010, to make their applications on the basis of scientific evidence, which we are now in the process of putting together, as well as other countries who have certain claims on the continental shelf. And then there is a mechanism to make the final determination who the continental shelf belongs to. So I'm quite encouraged that things are going to work out well, and that the Arctic is going to be the area of international cooperation. For Russia, incidentally, global warming is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's a selfish thing to say. But if the northern route opens up across the Arctic, and the prospects are such that it may happen before too long, will pose a very strong competition to the Suez Canal, because it's much you can move goods much quicker, a much shorter route from like Rotterdam to Tokyo through the Arctic route rather than through the Suez Canal. So we have all sorts of, no matter how the world turns, Russia benefits from it. Who was? One more question, please. You please. Let's say two more, because there is. Yes, you go first, and then you'll be the last one. Okay.
My name is Chase Walker. I'm representing Russia on General Assembly plenary. Given the recent attention that Russia, perhaps unfairly has been chided with what some have called abuse of the veto power among the P5. How does Russia envision, well, first, how does Russia respond to the change that others are posing for the Security Council? And if Russia had its perhaps first priority in UN reform, what would Russia like to see reformed first in the UN?
I'll begin. I'll give you a simple answer to the second question. We do believe that there is one moribund body which is there in the UN Charter, but which is not active at all, and this is the Military Staff Committee. The Military Staff Committee charter instrument, which is the military representatives of 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and they can involve other members of the Security Council, and they can give very good military expertise to the planning of peacekeeping operations. So this is one thing which we're advocating, resurrecting in a way, the Military Staff Committee, but for some political reasons we have some obstacles in that. And the first part, the veto power, I don't think we're abusing it. I mean, of course, historically, the United States has used the veto on many more occasions, mostly dealing with the Middle East. I have already cast 2 vetoes, I must admit, some guilt in that. But, I think we were doing the right thing. And in both cases, one was a resolution on Myanmar, and the other was a resolution on Zimbabwe. In both cases, China was also casting its veto, so it was a double veto. And to put it simply, we were doing that because the regional countries, in the case of Zimbabwe, let's take the case of Zimbabwe, South Africa was, the African Union was saying it would be wrong to pass this resolution. I had South African ambassador sitting next to me in the Security Council, neighboring Zimbabwe. He was telling me, if they pass this resolution, it's going to be a disaster, for Zimbabwe, for South Africa. So what we were saying, this is the opinion of the regional institutions. They believe it's wrong. They believe it's going to produce further crisis in Zimbabwe. We are not going this resolution to be passed. One thing which, when I say, some people think it's a joke, but then they come think of it and they probably start believing that it's not such a joke, that the veto power is also an element of democracy in the United Nations system. Because democracy is, of course, not so much about the rights of the majority, but also about the rights of the minority. In real life, there is such a constellation in the United Nations that very often there is a certain majority on one issue. But if you feel strongly enough about this issue, the possibility that one of the permanent 5 is going to cast his veto is preserving actually the rights of the minority. The United States is doing it on the Middle East. In the General Assembly, there is no veto, so the United States often votes alone against certain resolutions on the Middle East, but cannot prevent them from being passed. But in the Security Council, of course, it's much more serious because of the Chapter 7, the obligatory nature, mandatory nature of the UN Security Council resolution. So we are not, please don't worry, with all the reform discussions in the Security Council, the veto powers of the current permanent 5 will remain intact, I can tell you. Because there is no way, for the reform to be passed, it has to be ratified by all the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, including the Russian parliament. There is no way the Russian parliament can ratify a reform where Russian veto will be even weakened, let alone eliminated from the UN Charter. And other permanent 5 have the same position, let me tell you. So this is one strong element on which we are united with the United States and other permanent 5. Thank you very much.